Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Research for Social Impact podcast presented by the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University of Technology. My name is Susan Pizzati, and I'm the Principal Industry Fellow in Social Impact here at CSI Swinburne, and I'm delighted to be your host for this series. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are producing this podcast today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. For those of you who may not be familiar with CSI Swinburne, we are a highly industry-engaged, practice-oriented research and teaching centre based in Swinburne School of Business, Law and Entrepreneurship. We are one of 4 university-based nodes of the highly respected CSI National Network, which also includes the University of New South Wales, Flinders University and the University of Western Australia. Throughout this series, we'll be bringing you conversations, interviews and information from our researchers, sector experts, industry partners and even our students and alumni, aligned with our core areas of work, which include social entrepreneurship, social finance and investment, measuring and communicating social impact, community services innovation, and employment service system reform for marginalised groups. On this episode, we'll be taking a look at the findings of recent research conducted in partnership between CSI Swinburne and an organisation called Support Act, which explores the mental health and wellbeing of people working in creative industries in Australia. Support Act is a registered charity that works to relieve hardship or distress for people who work in creative industries in Australia. It provides crisis relief, mental health and wellbeing support to musicians, managers, crew and music workers across all genres of music who are in crisis or who are experiencing or at risk of psychological distress. Joining us from Support Act today is Ash King, who's the organisation's wellbeing and content and programs lead. Ash is a psychologist, writer, designer and researcher. After her life in the music industry came to a halt following a permanent vocal injury, she's now using psychology and mindfulness to help folks live their best lives with creativity, passion, and purpose. She's worked across a range of creative fields, including film and television, live music, visual arts, and radio. It's so great to have you with us, Ash. Welcome.
Thank you. Love the work you do. So I'm excited to be part of the convo today.
Fantastic. And we're also joined by the lead researcher on this project, Dr. Aurora Elmes. Aurora is a research fellow here at CSI Swinburne and has more than a decade of experience researching mental health and wellbeing in business, healthcare and community contexts. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation, Aurora.
Thanks, Susan. It's great to be here with you and Ash to share a little bit about our recent research on wellbeing in creative industries.
So that's probably a good place for us to start today. I'd love to know what's driven the need for this research. So Aurora, can you perhaps provide some background for us about the creative industries in Australia and what the research tells us about the industry?
Sure. So research on creative industries uses various definitions. So different research might include, for example, architecture and design, or be very focused in on more what we think of as, say, fine arts that people might go to a gallery to see or go to a performance to see. But for our research, we drew on input from Support Act, creative workplaces and other arts organisations and focused on the creative industries of music, visual arts, performing arts, literature, screen, multi-art form practice, community arts, First Nations arts and culture, emerging and experimental arts and digital games. So quite a diverse mix of different creative arts industries. And other research and census stats, as I said, sometimes includes other industries like advertising and marketing or software and digital content more broadly. And those kinds of industries are often counted in national stats.
Okay. But yours was sort of that first frame of reference, so not including those other areas. Yep.
That's right. So more on the sort of fine arts, performing arts, what people think of in terms of going to see a show or accessing arts content, like playing a digital game, for example.
Fantastic. And in terms of sort of the size and scope of the industry?
So because different definitions are used, the exact
Mm-hmm.
size and scope of creative industries in Australia is a little bit difficult to define, but there are some recent estimates suggesting creative industries employ almost 500,000 people in Australia. So it's not a small kind of sector. And alongside that, cultural and creative activity contributes around 122 billion to Australia's economy. So that's the 2019-2020 stat. So that's about 6% of gross domestic product if you're an economist type.
Yeah, wow. So it's quite significant, which is
Yes.
probably not something that a lot of people realise, actually. And so, Ash, what about from a practical perspective? What can you tell us about the role that creative industries play in society?
Well, if you think about, hopefully the role that the arts play in your life, they contribute to individual and community well-being. So
Mm.
many of us find a lot of joy and meaning by engaging with artistic pursuits, things
Hmm.
like amateur art and craft clubs, orchestras or choirs, drama, theatre and improv groups, dance classes, book clubs. I mean, I'm like a big book club fan myself. So, those are things where we're engaging with art, but many of us also enjoy experiencing the output or the things that are created by creative arts workers. So,
Mm.
if you like watching TV or movies, if you like going to the theatre to see drama, dance, circus, comedy, cabaret, or burlesque shows, if you like reading books or playing games or going to art museums and galleries, or if you like listening to music and going to see live gigs, you are engaging with the work of creative arts workers. And I don't know about you, but when I engage with this part of life, it makes my life richer. It makes it
Mm.
more fun to experience being a human being and having relationships where we can go and see gigs together or go walk through an art gallery together. So we have also seen in the literature that, studies have shown that engagement with the arts helps enhance positive mental health and life satisfaction for those of
Mhm.
us who are engaging with it, and can also be somewhat of a protection against mental distress. The concern with us is that over the past few years, these people who are making this work, these creative arts workers who are doing it in a professional capacity, have often been denied opportunities for expression and, crucially, for employment, which has placed psychological and economic burdens on many creative arts workers. So we need to protect these workers,
Mm.
especially when we consider what richness, what substance, and what sort of well-being boosts we get from engaging with the arts more broadly, not just as individuals, but also as societies.
It's so interesting. And you just made me think that so many of those things that you mentioned are really the aspects of life that, you really look forward to. You've either got a concert coming up or you're going to see an exhibition with some friends or whatever it might be. They're really sort of the high points in life so often. So it's really interesting to think about it from that other perspective as well. So what makes mental health and well-being a particularly important factor in this context, do you think, Ash?
Well, just to begin with, we need to be operating at a place where we are sort of mental health wise, to be able to just show up and do our jobs, but
Mhm.
also to be able to be creative. So our mental health and well-being will impact our productivity.
Mm.
It impacts motivation, like I said, creativity, and also just the ways that we generally show up, not just for work, but for life and relationships. So
Mm.
we were curious about what the sort of mental health landscape was looking like for creative arts workers, because we
Mhm.
want to understand how potentially that might then go on to impact the work that they're doing, but also how it might go on just to impact and shape their lives more broadly. So there's a lot of different elements which are quite unique to creative industries, which we recognize have an impact
Mhm.
on mental health and well-being. So I might actually just throw to Aurora to share some of those.
Yes, so there can be, in terms of the creative industries, obviously it's very diverse, and as we've talked about, it's incorporates a range of different sort of fields. But
Mm.
some of the things that can be common are things like job precarity, so having insecure work. A large proportion of creative workers may be self-employed or working as a freelancer or contractor, whereas comparatively few people may have ongoing or permanent work with leave entitlements. So that can affect the financial security that people experience, which we know can impact well-being. And in terms of working conditions, even people working in creative jobs don't necessarily have, one single stable workplace that they're going to. They may work across multiple sites, including different venues. They may have different conditions. The places they're working may or may not provide a safe and supportive work environment. So these kinds of things can impact on people's well-being in terms of workplace conditions. So and we know that with many people working as sole traders or in insecure work, there can be pressure to accept non-ideal working conditions just to get by.
Yeah, and there's also the piece about safety nets, which is interestingly where sort of Support Act first originated from. This idea that what happens if you can't show up and do your job? There's often not a lot of space within a lot of these industries, which are like, oh, if you have an accident or you can't show up to work, or you get sick. So that was something that really came to a head during the pandemic, right? Where a lot of people couldn't show up because the industry that they worked in was not in operation at the time. So it really highlighted to us, the degrees in which these people, these creative arts workers, are working in industries that aren't very stable and secure.
And that's obviously where Support Act comes in then, Ash. Can you tell us maybe a little bit more about the work that you do and how you address some of those issues?
Yeah, of course. So, like you mentioned, we're a not-for-profit organisation and we're established over 25 years ago. Again, the organisation was established to be kind of like a safety net for predominantly music industry workers, which is where it emerged from. And so we're dedicated to supporting the sort of the well-being of music and now more broadly creative arts workers. And the organisation first started out doing crisis relief. So again, people who weren't able to show up to work but still needed to, buy their groceries and pay their rent, needed to have some sort of short-term financial relief so that they could get back on their feet. And that's what Support Act helped to do. And we also ended up paying out over $30 million over the pandemic, which was through cash grants for the most part, so that a lot of these industry workers again could pay their rent and buy their groceries. So Support Act also provide mental health and wellbeing support, and we do this through mental health prevention, education and training programs. We've also got a mentally healthy workplace program, which is hopefully trying to step in on the more sort of structural organizational levels and talk about how mental health and wellbeing are critical and how we can help support one another to prioritize this. And we've also got the Support Act Wellbeing Helpline, which was established a number of years ago, and it's basically like the national EAP service for not only music workers, but now expanded to creative arts workers more broadly. So if you need to call someone up and get some advice or some support from people who understand the unique challenges facing those in creative arts industries, you can call the Wellbeing Helpline and they can help sort you out with some support.
Fantastic. So obviously a huge need there, as you've described, particularly through the course of the pandemic. And so what prompted this particular piece of research? What were you hoping to learn, Aurora?
So as Ash mentioned, and you mentioned the need during the pandemic and the impacts on, many people, but in particular those with insecure work, for example, was significant in terms of impacting people's well-being. So our initial research, we actually partnered, Support Act and CSI Swinburne partnered together in 2022 to look specifically at the impact of COVID-19 on the music industry and live performing arts industries. And it did show that people working in those industries had been significantly adversely impacted by the lockdowns and restrictions affecting their work. So losing out on work, losing out on income, which obviously is very stressful for people and has real tangible impacts on their quality of life.
And particularly with the pandemic, I would imagine when there's no end date to that at the time, like we just didn't know how long that was going to go on, did we? And it was just I think that was an added aspect there that made it particularly challenging. And Ash?
Yeah, so we obviously during that time had a sort of um, a heightened number of people, coming to us needing support, particularly the crisis relief program, as well as the Wellbeing helpline. So we really wanted to gain a better understanding around what were the most urgent and impactful issues that music workers at the time were facing then. And so now, like fast forward a little bit into the future, we want to see how things might have changed, how the landscape might have evolved or devolved over the past few years, and where the differences lie.
Fantastic. And what have you found?
So our 2024 research looked at how creative industries are recovering since COVID, and gave us an updated view of mental health and wellbeing, including the key and emerging issues affecting people now. So Ash, did you want to talk about the work that you've been doing more recently with Support Act around supporting people?
Yeah, so I actually came on board not too long before we actually conducted the 2022 survey. So I ended up going back to uni, getting my psych registration, and after having lived and like living and working within the music industry, my partner is a working musician, my sister was a songwriter, singer-songwriter living in Nashville. So much of my life was around music. So it was really amazing to come back into the industry in a bit of a new capacity. And a lot of the work that I do with Support Act is actually building out new programs and offerings. So during my time, we've established all of these awesome training programs, things to educate people around suicide prevention, bystander intervention training in the case of bullying and harassment and discrimination, recognizing that safety at work is a huge issue, and you can't, help support people improve mental health wise if they don't feel safe in their work environments. We also have workshops that are directed at creative arts workers and managers around just mental health and wellbeing 101 with self-care strategies, and also tips on how to support one another. Again, these things just seem like basic knowledge for us, but we never actually really learn them. And so it's great to sort of bring some of this info and psychoeducation to music workers and music organisations. We also help offer mental health first aid courses, and we've got community building initiatives too, such as our Sound Minds and Yarning Strong sessions. And we've also got a diversity, equity and inclusion program called Voices Amplified, which was fully devised and created by our First Nations team. So we are proud that we've got so much to offer, but we also want to make sure that the resources and training that we do have are, going to be meeting the needs and the demands of music workers and creative arts workers more broadly.
Fantastic. And so that's obviously where this piece of research has come in. And so what did you discover? Like, how have circumstances changed for creative workers since the pandemic?
So they have changed in a number of ways, and what we wanted to do was, as Ash was saying, expand this out to all creative industries. And we had about 1,500 participants who took part in an online survey and shared some of their experience with working in creative industries over the last 2 years up to 2024. We did have the largest representation from music, visual arts, craft and design and performing arts. So some of the things we looked at, we were able to look back to the 2022 research to see what had changed specifically around mental health for those groups. But we did find that about half of people felt that their industry was partly back on track after the COVID-19 disruptions, but most felt the recovery was not complete. And that aligns with some other research that's been done by pattern makers around audience outlook monitoring. So looking at how people are returning to things like live shows, and it's showing that recovery is continuing, but still in some cases moving more slowly due to a number of factors. And we did find, unfortunately, that less than a fifth of people said their workplace or work environment had changed for the better over the last 2 years. So a lot of those issues we were talking about in terms of job precarity, safety, those things, there's still a lot of change to be made. But of those who did say things have improved, just over half said their workplace or the spaces they work in are taking more steps to foster a physically and psychologically safe work environment. And just under half said that their workplace or work work environment culture actively supports mental health and well-being. So there is some change in that respect occurring, but sadly about 1/5 of our participants said they had left work in the creative industries either temporarily or permanently.
Oh, wow, that's huge, isn't it? And what are some of the main issues that they're describing that are leading to those decisions?
So a number of factors are affecting people, including over 2/3 of creative workers surveyed identified cost of living as a key issue. And we know that is obviously across the board, people are feeling pressure regardless of industry, but in an industry where there are particularly, insecure working conditions, people may not have much of a buffer, that is going to be significantly more impactful. And we also found over half identified low level of income from working in creative industries as an issue. So people were still experiencing things like reductions in income, which may not have recovered fully since COVID times. Almost half are reporting increased financial stress. We found, unfortunately, almost 1/5 of our respondents had a total annual income, either from creative work or any other sources, that was below the poverty line for a single working person in Australia.
Wow.
So obviously that impacts people's ability to live their life, enjoy their life, and can be very overwhelming in terms of stress. So a lot of workers were calling for a basic wage or a minimum wage requirements across industries. And one person said, we need a base wage for all working in the creative industries. Most of us have been working hard all our working lives for an absolute pittance. So people are really feeling undervalued and underpaid. We also found a lot of people reporting burnout and fatigue. About half were reporting that. Job insecurity was an issue for 43%, intertwined with lack of opportunities due to external impacts like venue closures, festival cancellations, high costs of doing business. And multiple people shared that while they engaged in creative practices personally, that didn't always enable them to earn a livable wage. So one person said, I believe in myself as an artist with something valuable to contribute, but I still feel like I'm on the outside. I'm working hard on a literature and music project. No one is paying me to do it. I have an unrelated job to earn money. So these kinds of issues indicate the economic challenges creative workers face in terms of being able to have adequate income and keep up with the cost of living and doing business are all taking a toll on mental health.
Yeah, wow.
And anecdotally as well, you just hear that some people think, oh, well, it's like a luxury to be able to be an artist or a creative arts worker. And it's kind of like, oh, well, you could get a real job and then you can do your arts work on the side, which I think really fails to respect and acknowledge the true benefit of having the arts exist in the worlds and societies that we live in, right? So it's like, if we want to keep enjoying the arts, we need to recognize that these things that are impacting the well-being and the productivity and the ability for people to show up and create as part of their jobs is really crucial. We need to address it.
Absolutely. And what are some of those specific mental health and wellbeing impacts that you're seeing?
So we found in our 2024 survey, about half of all our survey respondents reported increased feelings of anxiety or depression due to the issues affecting creative workers in 2024. And that is slightly lower than about 63% who reported mental health impacts in our 2022 survey, which was just music and live performing artists. But it's still a concerning proportion of people struggling with mental health.
And we also see, these stats come out in the people accessing our helpline. So the psychologists and counsellors who are manning the wellbeing helpline really share that most of the main concerns of people calling have to do with anxiety presentations, depression, and then just more generally career concerns, because it's a tough industry to work in.
Absolutely.
That's
and I would
right.
imagine as well, because the actual act of creating or performing is, so intrinsic to your well-being and mental health if you are an artist. So not being able to do that, as well as, having the additional concerns about, all of the other life factors around your income and job security, it's sort of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It's such a fascinating relationship to talk about, because often artists or creative arts workers use the medium that they exist in, whether it be as writers or as performers or as musicians, to sort of help manage their own well-being. They use it as a form of expression, but also as a form of ways of understanding themselves, understanding their place in the world, of creating, because creating feels good. But it becomes a little bit more complex when this is not only just an act of artistic expression. It's also what someone needs to do to be able to earn money to, support themselves or support their families. And so there's an additional pressure or burden that comes with that. Not only the ability to engage with the art practice, but make sure that that art practice is going to be viable to generate them income.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right.
Aurora?
Yes. Yeah, so when those, with those different factors at play, like Ash was saying, if things are a struggle, that can really impact people in terms of their levels of distress. And so we found that in our survey, over half of our respondents had high or very high levels of psychological distress. And that's compared to around 15%, which is what we see in the general population through things like the Australian Bureau of Statistics National Health and Mental Health and Wellbeing Survey. So it's a very high proportion compared to those kinds of general statistics. And within that, we find patterns that are sort of common in terms of mental health research, which find that people who have less access to social or financial resources or have more experiences of marginalisation tend to have higher levels of distress. So we found that people who were unemployed or underemployed, so working less hours than they wanted, or people who were out of the workforce for reasons like disability or illness impacting their current work capacity or managing caring responsibilities, they had higher levels of distress compared to the overall sample, as did people with lower income levels, younger people aged under 35, women and non-binary people who identified as LGBTQIA+, and neurodivergent people and those reporting a disability, chronic illness or injury. And just to reiterate, that's not necessarily about the characteristics of the people themselves, but often it's about the intersectional forms of discrimination and challenge that they experience just trying to navigate their everyday lives. So we did look back at our 2022 findings for people working in music and live performing arts, and we did find that about just over half of music and performing arts respondents had high distress in 2024 compared to about 2/3 in 2022. So we did see between the two groups that were surveyed 2 years apart, we did see a lower proportion of people with high distress compared to just after the pandemic kind of restrictions had been in place. But even so, the very high level of distress still remains concerning, along with other mental health findings, particularly around a very high proportion having experienced suicidal thoughts or behaviours at any time. It was about 57% in our survey. That is about 3.5 times the general population. So again, some of those factors coming into play around people's circumstances, access to resources and support, feeling valued in society, all of these things can impact people. And we did find also a fairly significant number, about 43%, of people still using alcohol or other substances to cope with stress, which is only slightly lower than the 53% reporting that in 2022.
So obviously really significant challenges that you're identifying there. But at the same time, I'm sure there are also some incredible examples of creativity and resilience that have emerged in response to that. Did your research capture any of that aspect at all?
It did. So we asked people what supported their well-being or made a difference to them. And overall, the things people most commonly said supported their mental health and well-being over the last 2 years were things like social, emotional, and practical support from people in their lives. So whether that's family, friends, community, things like self-care in terms of nutrition, movement, and sleep, and a third one, which kind of highlights the relationship between people's working circumstances, is a third factor that was important to people was being able to keep working in their creative industry, making enough money and having enough work, although that was not the case for everyone, because not everyone had that capacity, but you can see the relationship there between the work people are doing, whether they're able to make it, a financially sustainable life, and then the impact that has on people's well-being. So we know social support and self-care are important, but those broader factors like adequate income, decent employment conditions really can't be ignored when it comes to mental health. But we did also ask people what they felt good about, and we found people were feeling good about things like innovation and adaptability within their field, greater investment in First Nations arts and culture, and industries or workplaces taking positive steps to improve diversity, either within the workplace and or within content that's created. And people were, feeling good about where their workplaces had made changes to invest in resources, equipment, or improved processes, or increased awareness around mental health and the impact it has on creative work. And that some circles within creative arts communities are really trying to continue to foster and encourage community and professional networking within creative arts spaces. Ash, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the community piece and the support piece is really fascinating and crucial, because I think that there are some enduring myths about, the isolated artist or the tortured artist that kind of pin a lot of the suffering of artists as like a character trope or like a personality trait that's exclusive to people who decide that they want to do this type of work or create these types of things. And, I've sifted through the literature. This is something that's fascinated me from a really long age. I was like, do you need to be miserable and depressed to create? Do you need to be playing host to all of these challenging, overwhelming emotions to be able to contribute something of value artistically? And researchers have found that to be a curious question as well. So they've explored it in some research studies and haven't found any links to suggest that artists are more likely to suffer from certain types of mental illnesses or psychopathology. And when we can see, or when we take these questions to the community, to these arts workers themselves, we recognize actually no, there's a lot more sort of cultural and structural factors at play embedded within this industry that have been there for a long time, that are the things that are most likely to be contributing to the fact that these people are experiencing greater levels of psychological distress. So I think that that's necessary to recognize, and also that we can't exist and we can't do this type of work in isolation. We need to keep people connected with their communities. People need to feel like they have support, that they have people to open up to share to, people who are on their side or who understand their experiences. And so, yeah, that was a really important finding, I think, of the survey, to recognize that that is one of the most sort of protective features of creative arts workers.
That's really interesting, Ash. That phenomenon, as you say, is quite a stereotype, isn't it? When you look at a lot of the reporting and discussion around the arts. So it's just fascinating to see what that's uncovered.
I think it's fascinating as well, because the arts are like the only type of industry where when you hear about your favorite musician releasing a new album and they just broke up with their husband, or they've come out of a relationship, and everyone's like, yes, it's going to be so good, like what a good record. It's like, can you imagine how perverse that would be if you were like a lawyer showing up to work and be like, yes, this guy's going to show up so good to his job. It's like we've got this strange relationship with artists suffering, to feel like we can connect better with the art they make, or it's going to be of a higher quality. And I'm just like, I don't buy it.
Yeah, it's so true. I can think of so many examples of exactly that. Fascinating. And so, in terms of some of the supports and services that you've talked about, both Ash and Aurora, what are the things that you found have been most helpful for people to be able to tap into? And you've talked about some of them generally in terms of, access to community and those sorts of things. But are there specific services or supports that have been identified as being particularly beneficial?
Yeah, so we did ask people both if they had used Support Act services or other types of services, and a bit about their experiences of that. And we found people really valued both the practical and financial and also emotional support, which I think again ties back to you kind of can't separate out the need for those things. If people are struggling and their financial circumstances has a lot to do with that, there is a need for both that kind of practical support and emotional support. So one person said, I was able to access Support Act in a time of crisis. I don't know where I would have turned otherwise for financial support. The support payments I've received considerably lessened my stress and positively impacted my mental health. And respondents also talked about valuing the counsellors available through Support Act's Wellbeing helpline that Ash mentioned earlier, and the practical support resources and tools they offered. So one person said, my Support Act therapist gave me an absolute lifeline and helped me manage my stress when I felt overwhelmed. I can't recommend it highly enough for anyone in the industry. So we asked people who had used a Support Act service if it had made a positive contribution to their health and well-being, and about 96% of the 138 people who had accessed the service said it had made that positive contribution, and in some cases was life-saving. And outside of Support Act, the most commonly used other types of services were mental health services, which were used by almost a third of respondents, which is not surprising when you look at the levels of psychological distress that people are experiencing, and also income through Centrelink or Services Australia was used by about 15%. So again, the need for financial support is there, and general helplines were used by about 8.5%. So people reaching out to access other kind of more broad, non-specialised forms of mental health support. And we looked at barriers to accessing support, because we know this can be an issue in terms of awareness is great. It's really important services are there, but sometimes there can be barriers for people to getting the support they need. And we found the most commonly identified service barrier was cost or affordability for about 40% of people, as well as feeling the need to prioritise work first for about 36%. So that is concerning as well, if people are feeling like they have to finish this gig, they have to finish this project before they can then go and get support for themselves. And we also found some barriers around services being hard to access, or people feeling skeptical about whether services or supports would help them or be appropriate. So some issues around that as well, which again ties back into the need for support that takes into account people's circumstances and understands the realities of their day-to-day life and what they may need assistance with.
And for anyone who's listening today who might want to know what they can do to support our Australian creatives, do you have any tips or suggestions, Ash?
Yeah, so I think on an individual and community level, there's lots that we can do. And, maybe that's host your own shows or invite artists to use spaces that are available to you. Go to gigs and festivals and pre-book your tickets, okay? Because it's really important, especially for venue organizers and for the artists to know that people are going to show up. Go to the theatre, buy merch, buy albums, go to museums and galleries, buy art. You go to the movies, go to indie bookstores and buy books. Even borrowing books from the library gives a little sliver to the authors, which I only learned earlier this year. So I also think that it's useful to be mindful of how and where you're consuming art. A lot of people access movies and TV and music illegally, and it's easy to kind of detach yourself from the reality of who you're depriving when you're doing that. And you're like, I just guess I'll stream this movie here, or I'll just get this album. I mean, I remember the big bad days of burning albums and downloading whole artist catalogs. But sort of not everything also has to cost money when you're supporting the arts. Tell your friends about a great new artist you discovered, or share about an awesome gallery show on social media. There are plenty of ways to support the arts, and we have to keep supporting the arts if we want to keep enjoying all of these wonderful experiences that make our lives much more richer and rewarding. Of course, Support Act is a charity, so you can also donate to Support Act and help us do the work that we do. We have a really big fundraising day called Oz Music T-shirt Day, where you can buy an Australian music tee, you rock it at your work, get your team involved, everyone wears their favorite t-shirts, whether you buy those t-shirts through the Support Act campaign or whether you just go and support your artists by buying their merch. We just love whatever you can do to really just show that you're getting behind these incredible artists and music makers that make our lives so much better.
Yeah, I love that. And Aurora?
So I think I always go back to what are the participants of our research saying, and we did ask people what was needed, and overall the findings really emphasise the need for, as well as those actions that Ash was talking about. We need broader changes that address those core needs for adequate, consistent income, employment conditions that value creative workers and protect people's physical and mental health and enable positive mental health. So one person said, more funding for arts in general, as the problem lies in lack of opportunity and support for artists in Australia. Mental health support is important, but it deals with the symptom, not the disease. And another person said, advocacy to help increase the value of music in Australia and therefore the potential to earn a sustainable, healthy wage working in the music industry. So some of that cultural change around supporting the arts. So as I mentioned, things like improving pay standards, working conditions, and those were really the things that people often came back to. And those kinds of things require obviously commitment from governing institutions and organisations themselves to make those changes, not just individuals.
Absolutely. That's really fascinating. And I can't believe we're already at the stage where I'm having to ask you a final question for this conversation, because I feel like there's so much more that we could cover. But this is a question that I like to ask all of our guests on the podcast. I'd really love to know from both of you, if you had an unlimited budget to put towards a new piece of social impact research or education around this area, what would you spend it on? Who'd like to go first?
I'm happy to go, and then I'll leave Ash to wrap up. So I think in terms of research, again, I'd lean towards what are the things that people are calling for and how can that be implemented and brought about. So looking at how those working conditions can or are being improved in organisations, looking at examples of good practice, of how that's changed, or through policy changes and investment and cultural shift, how things can be improved overall and how learning and resources can be shared to support that continued shift. What about you, Ash?
Yeah, I think mine would be, okay, so there's a few initiatives that are sort of currently being tried out internationally with universal basic income for artists or creative arts workers. So, my study would be, let's equip a bunch of working creatives with enough money to meet, their basic needs across the span of a year and see how that might impact both the quality of the work and the quality of their lives.
I love that. Fantastic. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you both so much for your time today. It's been a really fantastic discussion, and there's obviously so much for us to all think about and unpack in there, both in terms of anybody who's working in the industry, or for those of us who have engagements with the industry, and how we can, change our own behaviours to perhaps provide a little bit more support. If people would like to get in touch with you for more information, what's the best way for them to be able to connect? Aurora?
So probably email, which is aelmes@swin.edu.au, or you can just Google Aurora Elmes Swinburne and you'll find me on the internet.
Fantastic. And Ash?
Yeah, so you can just hit me up through the Support Act website. There's everything that you need at the Support Act website as well. So if you have liked the sound of any of our sort of training or support programs, you can learn more about our crisis relief programs, our education and training programs, and our Wellbeing helpline, which is available to all creative arts workers across Australia. It's free, it's confidential, it gives you access to 12 counselling sessions per year. And people who have used the helpline have shared how beneficial they've found it, just like what Aurora reported on earlier through our survey. So definitely keep the number handy. Use it when you need it. Again, it's staffed with counsellors and psychologists who understand the unique challenges that face creative arts workers. And we also have dedicated support lines for First Nations people, LGBTQIA+ community members, for managers or anyone responsible for leading teams or managing people, and also if you're experiencing safety at work issues.
Amazing. And we'll obviously include a list of all of those available services in our show notes too. So it's nice and easy for you to be able to access them. Well, we hope you've enjoyed our conversation with Ash and Aurora, learning more about the creative industries in Australia and the challenges and supports available for many of our fabulous artists and supporting professions. As Ash mentioned earlier, the industry plays such an important role in maintaining our overall societal wellbeing, so understanding how we can better support them as a community is incredibly important. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you can join us again soon.